The first thing Kale remembered about the outside world was the smell of rain on hot concrete. He was 6 years old the last time he stood in it, barefooted on the driveway of a house that no longer existed, watching the drops darken the pavement in spreading dark circles. His mother had been standing beside him. She'd taken his hand without saying anything, and they'd stayed like that until the clouds broke and the sun came back. And she'd laughed because it was a good laugh day, and he had laughed too because he didn't need a reason. That was 17 years ago, before Gurren came. He stood at the window now. It was the only window, and it faced east, and watched the sun drag itself over the rim of the burned hills. The glass was old and wavy and made the light look liquid. He pressed one hand against it and felt the cold come through. 17 years since rain. 17 years since a good laugh day. He kept a list of things he'd lost track of. The list was longer than the window was wide. "You're fogging it up again," said a voice behind him. He didn't turn around. "Good morning, Nara." She was already at the small field stove, crouched over it with a ration brick and the long-handled lighter they'd salvaged from the transit depot 6 months back. She was 44 years old and moved like someone who had never been young, which was not true but felt true. Her hair was white at the temples and black everywhere else, pulled back with a strip of cable insulation. She'd been his father's navigator. She was the closest thing he had left to family that wasn't underground. "Chiron's sweep pattern changed last night," she said. "Southeast quadrant. I tracked it on the receiver." "How far out?" 8 kilometers, maybe 9. They're running a new formation, tighter. 3 ship clusters instead of the old pairs. Kale let his hand drop from the glass. The condensation from his palm left a perfect outline there, already shrinking. He watched it go. "They found the heartfelt cell," he said. It wasn't a question. Nara didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. He turned from the window. The room was small and low-ceilinged, once a storage space for a processing facility that had made agricultural chemicals. The shelves were still bolted to the walls, empty now except for their gear, their ration supply, the receiver unit, and a hand-drawn map of the Chiron patrol corridors that Nara updated every evening with a grease pencil. The map covered most of one shelf and had been redrawn so many times that the paper was soft as cloth. She handed him a cup of reconstituted broth. It was always bad. He always drank it. "What happened to them?" he asked. "Hartfield and 2 others made it to the drainage corridor. The rest." She stopped. She picked up her own cup and looked at it. They used the wideband emitter, the one that operates in the 40 kilohertz range. Kale sat down on the edge of his cot. He knew the 40 kilohertz emitter. Every survivor did. It was the weapon the Chiron had developed in their 3rd year on Earth, after they'd realized that conventional arms were costing them too many of their own. It operated on a frequency that did something to the inner ear, something to the fluid architecture of the brain, and human beings who were caught in its field lived for approximately 12 minutes afterward, though lived was too generous a word for what those 12 minutes were. He drank his broth. Outside, the sky was going from gray to the color of old bone. "The packet from Celine came through," Nara said after a while. He looked up. "She wants to move the timeline. Push it forward 3 weeks. 3 weeks isn't enough time. She knows that. She said it anyway. Celine was not her real name. Nobody used real names anymore. Not over the receiver. Not in person with anyone they hadn't known before the fall. She was the operational coordinator for what remained of the Red Line network. A loose lattice of human resistance cells stretched across the eastern seaboard, connected by encrypted burst transmissions and maintained by approximately 40 people doing the work of 400. Kale had met her once 2 years ago in a basement in what had been Providence. She was small and precise, and her eyes were the color of winter water, and she had told him, without any particular drama, that he was the best infiltrator alive. He'd told her that wasn't saying much. She'd said it was saying enough. The operation was called Threshold. Its objective was to penetrate the Chiron ground installation at Maddock, compromise the facility's core containment systems, and trigger a chain reaction that would depressurize every holding module on the lower levels. 312 humans were being held in those modules. They had been there, some of them, since the early occupation years. The Chiron didn't kill their captives. They studied them, which in some ways was worse. Kale's mother was one of the 312. He hadn't told Celine that. He didn't think it would have changed anything, but he hadn't wanted to find out. He stood up and began pulling on his field jacket. It was a patchwork thing, leather and insulated fabric, and sections of what had once been a vehicle seat cover. and it had a deep inner pocket on the left side where he kept the thing he was never supposed to carry on operation. He put it in there now and felt the familiar weight of it settle against his ribs. A folded photograph. His mother, young, in rain. "Tell Celine we can be ready," he said. "But I need the access codes by the end of the week. I'll transmit at the next window." Nara paused with the lighter in her hand, looking at him in the particular way she had when she was deciding whether to say something. She decided, "Kale, if this goes wrong, we won't talk about that. We should. We won't." He touched her shoulder, briefly, the way you touch someone when you want to say something you don't have words for. Then he shouldered his pack and went to the door. He stopped there, hand on the frame, not looking back. "Update the map. The new formation pattern. I want to memorize it tonight." He heard her pick up the grease pencil. He went out into the morning. The road to the Chiron installation at Medoc was not a road. It was a sequence of decisions, drainage ditches, collapsed structures, the remains of an overpass, a kilometer of dense secondary growth that had reclaimed a retail corridor so completely that you had to know where the pavement was before you could find it under the roots. Kale had walked it 7 times in the past 2 months in preparation. He could walk it blind, and on the 3rd run he had. The Chiron patrol corridors were plotted around the assumption that humans moved like humans, which was to say in straight lines, along predictable paths, toward obvious objectives. The Chiron had studied human behavior extensively and had still managed to miss the central thing about it, which was that human beings, when frightened enough and alive long enough, stopped being predictable almost entirely. He reached the outer perimeter of the Medoc installation in the early afternoon. He lay flat in the scrub for 20 minutes watching. The Chiron architecture was hard to look at directly. It wasn't that the eye refused. The eye could see it fine. But the brain kept trying to resolve it into something recognizable and failing. The structures were organic and angular at the same time, grown from a resinous material that the Chiron secreted, or manufactured, or both, in shades of dark amber and deep brown that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. They didn't cast shadows the way human-built structures did. They seemed to drink the light around them. The installation at Medoc had been built over the site of an existing mountain complex, and the Chiron had not demolished what was already there. They had grown their own architecture over it and through it, so that concrete walls and resin walls shared the same space. And the whole thing looked like a body that had been partially colonized by something else. He watched the patrols, 3 ship clusters, as Nara had said. The Chiron were bipedal, roughly, though the proportions were wrong by any human standard. The limbs too long, the torso too compressed, the head a flattened ovoid that could rotate further than a human neck and faster. They moved in a loose formation, each unit maintaining a precise spacing from the others, and they communicated in what sounded like subsonic vibration when they communicated at all. Mostly they moved in silence. They didn't appear to breathe, or if they did, it wasn't visible at this range. What they were doing at Medoc, what they were doing in all the installations, had been the subject of more human speculation than any other single question in 17 years. The Chiron hadn't made their intentions clear. They'd arrived, they'd swept, they'd occupied, they'd built, they'd begun taking humans. The taking was systematic enough to be a program, but not regular enough to be fully mapped. Some of the taken were never seen again. Some ended up in the holding modules, alive, apparently intact. What happened to the ones who weren't in the modules was something nobody who might know was talking about. Kale had his own theory. He kept it to himself. It didn't change the plan. He moved. The access point was a drainage tunnel that predated the Chiron installation, a concrete throat that ran under the east flank of the complex and had been overlooked, apparently, because the Chiron had grown their resin over its mouth and didn't seem to know it had another end. Kale had found it 6 weeks ago on his 4th reconnaissance run, following a hunch and a water stain on the hillside. He'd told Nara. He hadn't told Celine because Celine's network had leaks, and this was too important to risk to a leak. The access point was his. He was keeping it that way. He entered the tunnel on his belly and moved through it with his elbows and the balls of his feet, slow and methodical, the way a man moves when he knows that haste will kill him. The smell inside was extraordinary, old concrete and water and something chemical and sharp that was the smell of the Chiron resin which had seeped into the tunnel walls through the surrounding substrate. The smell made his eyes water. He breathed through his mouth and kept moving. The tunnel opened into a utility corridor on the mountain complex's lowest level, below the Chiron addition. The lights were still on down here. The Chiron had kept the original facility's power running. This was something the human intelligence community had noticed early and puzzled over. The Chiron were capable of generating their own power through methods that human engineers had been studying for 12 years without fully comprehending, but they maintained the original human electrical grid in every occupied facility. The working theory was efficiency. Kale's theory was something else. He stood up in the corridor, brushed grit from his jacket, and listened. Silence. The hum of old fluorescent fixtures. The distant, felt rather than heard throb of the Chiron systems in the levels above. He walked. The facility had been a government research complex once, something classified that nobody outside it had known about, and everybody had theories about. The Chiron had repurposed it without removing any of the original infrastructure. The signage was still on the walls, stenciled directions, room numbers, safety notices about materials he'd never heard of. He followed the signage down and east, toward the holding modules. He'd memorized the map he'd reconstructed from aerial imagery and from the accounts of 3 different survivors who'd spent time inside before escaping. He found the first Chiron sensor cluster 40 meters from the module block. It was mounted at ceiling height, a smooth amber lens ringed with what looked like cilia but weren't, slowly moving in a pattern that wasn't random. He stopped, pressed himself against the wall, and studied it. The sensor clusters operated on light differential. They detected change in the optical environment, not presence within it. He'd learned this from Nara, who'd learned it from a physicist in the Selene network who'd been captured by a different cluster 3 months later. He counted the pattern. He watched 2 full cycles. Then he moved through the sensor's field during the 38-second window, when its attention, for lack of a better word, was oriented upward. He made it through. The holding modules were behind a door that was both a human pressure seal and something the Chiron had added, a resin interface layer that bonded to the original door frame and contained something that functioned like a lock but operated through principles he couldn't identify. He'd brought a tool for it, something Nara's physicist contact had designed before his capture, a field emitter that generated a precise electromagnetic pulse on a narrow spectrum. He didn't know how it worked. He didn't need to. He pressed it against the resin interface and held it for the required count, and the door opened. Inside, the smell changed entirely. It was human. Sweat, breath, the specific staleness of confined bodies. It hit him the way smells hit you when they're connected to something deep, and he had to stop for a moment in the doorway and just stand there and not think too hard about why his chest had done what it just did. The holding space was a long room that had once been a laboratory. The modules were individual units, roughly the size of a sleeping space, with walls of the same resin material. Each unit had a grated front panel. Through the panels, he could see people. Most of them were awake. They looked at him without speaking. He walked down the row. He found her in the 11th module. She was older than the photograph. Of course she was. She was older than the woman he'd been constructing and reconstructing in his imagination for 17 years, which was not the woman in the photograph and not whatever he'd been building in the dark. She was a real person in a room, and she had gray in her hair and a scar above her left eyebrow that he didn't recognize, and she was looking at him the way you look at something you've spent so long not hoping for. That hope has become dangerous. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "I'm Kale," he said, because he didn't know what else to start with. "I know who you are," she said. Her voice was rougher than he'd expected. "You look like your father." He pressed his palm against the resin panel. The warmth of the material surprised him. He'd expected cold. "I'm going to get you out," he said. She looked at his hand against the panel. She looked at him. How many? He understood what she was asking. Not just herself. All of them. All of them, he said. "That's the plan." "What's the plan?" "Controlled depressurization of the module block. The Chiron systems use a closed atmospheric circuit for the holding spaces. Different pressure gradient from the rest of the facility. If I can access the environmental control node and trigger a reversal event, it'll open every module simultaneously and seal the Chiron access points. You'll have a window. 12 minutes, maybe 15. She studied him. "And you know how to do this?" "I know enough. That's not the same thing." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." Something shifted in her face. Not a smile, not quite. The shadow of one worn smooth. "Your father used to say that, 'I know enough,' every time he was doing something that was going to get him killed." "Tell me about that later." He moved to the environmental control node at the far end of the module block. He'd studied its configuration from reconstructed schematics. But schematics were always wrong in some respect, and this one was wrong in the expected ways. Connections transposed, a secondary panel that didn't appear in the documentation, a power routing that made no sense in the original design but had clearly been modified. He crouched in front of it and opened his pack and spread his tools on the floor and began. His hands knew things his brain was still arguing about. That was the gift of preparation. When the moment came, the hands were already there. He'd spent 60 hours in a mock-up Nara had built from salvaged components, doing this exact sequence. His hands ran the sequence now while his brain listened to the building around him and counted the seconds and calculated the drift against the patrol cycles. Above him, through the floors, he could feel the Chiron moving. Not here, not exactly. It was more like the installation had a pulse, a low and alien rhythm, and he'd learned to read it the way you learn to read water or wind. He was 12 minutes into the work when the pulse changed. He stopped. His hand stopped. He listened to the new rhythm. They'd found the tunnel. It wasn't a guess. The pattern of movement above him shifted in a way he recognized from his study of the patrol formations, a coordinated redirection. 3 clusters moving from their regular corridors toward a new locus. The tunnel entrance was the new locus. Someone or something had triggered a detection, maybe a sensor he hadn't mapped, maybe the electromagnetic pulse from the door tool, maybe something simpler, a scuff mark in the grid of the tunnel floor or his thermal signature on the resin walls. It didn't matter. They were coming. He had 2 choices. He could run, back through the tunnel, out into the hillside, and lose whatever chance remained at threshold. Or he could finish the work. He looked down at the open panel in front of him. He was 4 minutes away, maybe 5. The Chiron would be at the module block entrance in 8, maybe 10, if they were moving at normal speed and using the internal corridors. If they were moving fast, 6. He picked up his tools and kept going. The work was the work. He narrowed everything down to the panel, the components, the sequence. The rest of the world, the approaching patrol, the building above him, the photograph against his ribs, the woman in the 11th module watching him through the resin grate, all of it went small and far away, the way things go when there's only one thing left that matters. The node completed its configuration cycle and held. He closed the panel. He stood up. He looked at the row of modules. "Everyone listen," he said, loudly enough to reach them all. "In about 90 seconds, the panels will open. You move immediately. Do not stop. Do not help anyone who falls. There's no time. You go to the far end of this room and through the door I came from, and you follow the corridor to the drainage tunnel. Crawl through it. Stay low. The entrance is on the east hillside. Get into the tree cover and keep moving east. There are people waiting at the 8-kilometer mark." This was not entirely true. There were no people at the 8-kilometer mark, because this operation had not been sanctioned, and nobody else knew about it. But he needed them moving, and he needed them moving in a direction, and east was the right direction. A sound from the module block entrance. The heavy vibration sound that meant Chiron. The environmental system shifted. It was not dramatic. There was no hiss of atmosphere, no visible change. It was just a change in the pressure against his eardrums, a slight and sudden equalization. And then every module panel swung open, smoothly and simultaneously, with the soft mechanical certainty of a lock releasing. The humans came out. He'd expected some of them to be too far gone to move quickly. Some were. But most of them moved with the particular urgency of people who have been waiting for an exit for a very long time, who have spent weeks or months or years cataloging the exact position of their module panel and planning the first second of freedom so precisely that when it came, the body simply executed the plan. They were thin. They were pale. They were moving. His mother was the 3rd out of her module. She looked at him once. Then she looked at the exit door and began to move. The module block entrance shuddered. The Chiron were through the atmospheric seal. He could hear them now. The subsonic vibration of their communication. The particular sound their locomotion made on the hard floor, different from human footfall. A kind of rapid, deliberate pressure. 2 of them, maybe 3. He stood in the center of the room. There was a story Nara had told him once about his father. It was a simple story. His father had been part of the early resistance networks in the first years of the occupation, when resistance meant something more like desperation than strategy. He'd been surrounded once, in a corridor not unlike this one, with a group of survivors behind him and the Chiron in front. He hadn't had a weapon worth the name. He'd had a timing device and a section of electrical conduit and the knowledge from his work as an engineer that Chiron's sensory systems operated on a frequency close enough to certain electrical interference patterns that the right kind of burst in the right physical environment could blind them briefly. Not kill, blind. He'd bought the people behind him 40 seconds. It had been enough. Kale reached into his pack and found the last of his tools. The Chiron came through the door. They were extraordinary. He'd seen them from distance and through glass and in the degraded footage that circulated through the Red Line network, but close, in the flat fluorescent light of the corridor, they were something else. They were taller than he'd registered, close to 2.5 meters, and the way they moved carried an absolute confidence that was not arrogance, but simply the expression of a body that had never once encountered an environment it could not navigate. Their sensory organs, the paired structures on either side of the flattened head, were oriented directly at him. He could feel it, not metaphorically. He could feel it, the way you feel eyes on you in the dark, except these weren't eyes and this wasn't metaphor. He held his ground. This was the part nobody planned for, because nobody expected to be here. The plans always ended at egress. The plans assumed a clean withdrawal, or at worst a running fight through corridors. Nobody built the plan around standing in a room alone while the Chiron figured out what was in front of them. He thought, briefly, of the rain, of the smell of it on hot concrete, of his mother's hand in his, slick from the water. He pressed the field emitter against the nearest junction box in the wall, set it for maximum output, and triggered it. The burst was not visible. Sound barely. A crackle, gone in less than a second, but the effect was immediate and total. The Chiron froze. Not fell, not stumbled, froze, their locomotion interrupted mid-stride, their sensory organs oscillating rapidly, disoriented. The interference pattern was exactly what his father's story said it would be. The Chiron sensory architecture, so refined, so precise, was vulnerable to this specific kind of noise. Not long, not catastrophically, but enough. 40 seconds. He ran. He ran the corridor from memory, the way he'd memorized it, the way the cot springs feel when you've counted them enough times. He hit the tunnel entrance at speed and went in head first, and the concrete and darkness and the chemical smell of the resin closed over him, and he moved through it without thinking, just moving through the smell and the cold and the narrowness of it. And then there was light, and he was out on the hillside in the morning air, and the sun was coming over the ridge in a long, flat band, and there were people in the tree line, moving, his mother among them, turning back to look for him. She saw him come out of the tunnel mouth. He crossed the ground between them at a run that became a walk when he was close, some belated dignity kicking in, and she stood there and waited, and they looked at each other in the ordinary sunlight. She reached out and straightened the collar of his jacket. It was such a specific gesture, so ordinary, so entirely in the wrong place and time. He felt something break loose in his chest. She kept her hands on the lapels of his jacket. 17 years, she said. Yeah, you could have been taller. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. She made the same sound. It wasn't a good laugh day. It was something better, a real one, a brief and honest one. Standing in the sunlight with Kieran's sensors sweeping overhead and 100 and some odd survivors disappearing into the tree line around them. We have to go, he said. I know. But she didn't let go of his jacket for another moment. You're going to tell me how you found this place. I'll tell you everything. And what your plan was. I had a plan. It had holes in it. It had some holes. Your father's plans always had holes. She said it with something in her voice that wasn't sorrow and wasn't pride, but sat between them, warm. He always found ways to fill them. She released his jacket. She straightened up. She looked at the tree line, at the moving shapes of the people they'd freed, and she looked at him once more, and he could see her doing the thing he recognized from the photograph, squaring something in herself, that particular set of the jaw. East, she said. East. She turned and walked into the trees. He followed. They moved fast, and they moved quiet, the way people move when they know the alternative. The group was too large for real stealth, but most of them seemed to understand the principle of it, and the ones who didn't were close enough to the ones who did, that the silent pressure of competence moved through the group like a current. He stayed at the rear, watching the sky. The current patrol ships, when they came, would come fast, and they would come from the installation direction. He kept the installation at his back and tracked the sky. Nara found them at the 3-kilometer mark. He heard her first. The particular way she moved through underbrush, slightly louder than necessary because she knew he'd be listening and wanted to be heard before she appeared. She came out of the trees with her pack and her receiver, and her face carefully arranged into its default expression of skeptical competence. She looked at the group of survivors. She counted them, visibly, moving her lips slightly. She looked at him. "You moved without telling Celine," she said. "The timeline changed." "The timeline changed because you changed it." "The timeline changed because the Hartfield cell was gone, and the Chiron were tightening the patrol grid, and waiting another 3 weeks meant 20% of these people wouldn't have made it to the next window." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at his mother, who was standing a few meters away watching this exchange with a precise, assessing expression. "You're Rena," Nara said. "You're Nara," his mother said. "He told me about you. In the 11 minutes we've been talking. He always talks too much." "He talks exactly enough," his mother said. "I've already established that." Something moved through Nara's face. He'd known her long enough to translate it. She was filing this information for future use. "We can't go to the 8-kilometer position," Nara said, turning back to him. "The sweep pattern extended. I picked it up 20 minutes ago. How far extended? Past 10. Maybe 12. Then we go north. There's a transit cut north of here. Old highway maintenance access. It runs 8 kilometers undercover before it opens. We can move through it faster than the open ground. I don't have that on the map. I found it on the 3rd run I was going to tell you." Nara looked at him. "You are exactly your father's son," she said, and started north. They moved through the transit cut for 2 hours. It was easier than the open ground. The cut was deep and overgrown, and the canopy closed over it into a low tunnel of leaves and light, and the Chiron patrol ships swept overhead twice without dropping. He tracked the sound of them by ear and the shift in light when they crossed the sun, and each time he held up his fist, and the group stopped and was still, and each time the ships passed without slowing. At the northern end of the cut, there was a structure. It had been a maintenance depot, long abandoned. The roof partially collapsed. It was dry inside and out of the wind. They stopped there. He went around to each person. He didn't know most of them. He learned names when offered and didn't push when they weren't. Some of them needed medical attention he couldn't provide. Nara was doing what she could with what they had. Some of them just needed to sit against a wall and look at the light coming through the broken roof. He let them do that. His mother found a corner and sat down, and he sat beside her. She'd found a piece of something, old packaging material, stiff and yellowed, and was using it to make note of the other survivors, working from memory, cataloging who was who and what their condition was. Even now, still working, he watched her do it and thought, yes. There were more of them, she said, without looking up from her notes. Originally, they moved 17 people to the upper levels 8 months ago. I don't know what happened to them. I'll find out. We'll find out. She made another note. I have 17 years of information about Chiron facility operations. I've been watching and recording everything I could observe from inside. I have it all memorized. She touched her temple. In here. We need a way to get it out. The Red Line Network can. Not the Red Line Network. She looked at him then, directly. I know who in the Red Line Network talks too much and to whom. I've seen the effects of those leaks from the inside. Celine runs a good operation with bad material. She tapped her temple again. This goes somewhere specific. Somewhere clean. He thought about that. He'd been thinking about clean operations for a long time without finding one. We'll build it, he said. She looked at him with the careful, appraising look he recognized from the photograph, that he recognized from nothing and everything, that he'd apparently been seeing in his own mirror for 17 years without knowing where it came from. All right, she said. Outside, someone had started humming. He couldn't identify the song. It wasn't something he recognized. But it was there, threading through the sound of wind and light, through broken roof panels and the settling of tired bodies against walls. Something small and human and persistent. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket. He took out the photograph and looked at it for a moment. His mother, young, in rain, laughing at something he couldn't see. Then he folded it again and put it away. He leaned his head back against the wall. He thought about what Celine would say when they made contact. He thought about the 17 people moved to the upper levels. He thought about the Chiron installation, still standing in the valley below Maddock, and the 312 minus the 100 and some survivors still in the modules, and the ones who were never in the modules at all. He thought about the sweep pattern and the new formation, and the 40 kilohertz emitter, and the things humanity had learned in 17 years of losing, and and the few specific things it had found by being exactly what it was: stubborn and lateral, and full of holes patched in real time with whatever was at hand. Nara appeared in the doorway and looked at him. He raised an eyebrow. "Receivers picking up a red line burst from the north," she said. "Another cell, 40 kilometers. They're asking if anyone survived the Heartfield action." "Transmit our position," he said. "Standard protocol." "And the others?" He looked around the room. The survivors. The thin faces and the careful eyes and the person in the corner still humming something nameless and persistent. "Tell them we have 104, he said. "Tell them we need medical. Tell them we need cover. And tell them," he paused. He thought about the right way to say it, and then decided there wasn't a right way and said it plainly. "Tell them we went inside Madoc and came back out." Nara stood in the doorway for a moment. "That's going to change things," she said. "I know." She went to the receiver. He sat with his back against the wall in the broken light, and outside the wind moved through the trees with the sound that wind makes through trees, which is a human sound even when it isn't, because the ones who named it were human, and the ones listening to it now were too. And that was the thing the Chiron had cataloged and studied and failed to model. Not the powers or the weapons or the tactics, but the thing underneath all of it, the deep and unkillable stubbornness of a creature that will sit in a broken building on the far side of the worst thing that ever happened to it and listen to the wind and find it, still, sufficient reason to continue. His mother finished her notes. The humming continued. They waited for the contact, and then they would move again, and then there would be more and then more still, and none of it would be clean or easy or anything like enough, and they would do it anyway, because that was the only answer they'd ever found that worked. The wind moved through the trees. Cale closed his eyes and listened.